Hello, it's Maggie the Cheshire Crafter here. Now I've been making a patchwork quilt for my friend's birthday. Come into the kitchen with me and I'll show you how I did it. I've laid out my quilt with my backing fabric, which is the repeat yellow from the front, and wadding, and I lay it out on my bed and then roll it down in order to pin baste it. I've got as far as this layer here and I'm using my basting pins. Now normally I say leave extra fabric. The fabric for the backing is exactly the same as the width, 54 inches, so I'm making sure I'm exact. If I have a problem, I can move in slightly and make this width shorter, but I'm really sailing close to the wind here. Once I've rolled it up, it's then ready to go back to the kitchen, ready for quilting. I lengthen my stitch from a 2.5 to a 3, which makes quilting a lot easier. I'm going to begin quilting this quilt from the middle, and I'm going to do it horizontally. So in order to take a mark out from the patchwork into the border, I need to mark it with an erasable ink pen, just very gently so that I can see, and I'll need to do the same at the other end. And you'll see that I've rolled up my fabric at either side to get it underneath the machine, and I'm going to begin sewing here. And you'll see that I'm stitching just next to this line, just to one side, about 1/8 of an inch. For subsequent rows, I'm going to use the guide bar to help me. This is an attachment that goes into the side of the walking foot, and I want it to be the distance of each square. The guide will fit either to the right or the left of your walking foot and fits into the little slot in the back. As you look at the front, where I want my stitching to be, I now have my guide foot, can you see it, just sitting on that row of stitching. I'm going to back up and start from the border, and that guide will follow the row of stitching while I concentrate on stitching here. That way I'll get a parallel line without marking it across the borders where I'm not marking the fabric. This is a hot and heavy work, so stay hydrated. I have a lemon tea and a coffee, but they're nowhere near my work. I don't want to get coffee on my fabric. When I reach the applique, I'm stopping my needle just beyond the fabric. I'm going to release the foot and move the needle to the other side and cut the threads. I'll tie the threads in on the back. This means that there'll be a section here where there's no quilting on the back or the front, but it will leave the applique untouched. So having completed one side, I've started back in the middle and I'm working now to the right, and this time I want the stitches to come below this stitch line. As you can see, I want them to match here. So it'll be this side of the stitch line to the left of the stitch line. Fortunately, the 2-inch wide quilting lines run either side of the lace, and I'm just able to gently ease the buttons that I've sewn on out of the way. The walking foot will just gently ease them up. Go careful if you've done that this way. I think in a future quilt I'll sew things on after I've quilted them rather than before. Where there's a notable error like this kink, I'm unpicking it and I'm sewing it again, working from here outwards. I'm not unpicking the whole line. On the front and on the back, I sew in all the loose ends to bury them. To sew on my trim, I'm using this Coats Anchor vintage thread. This is a 36 weight mercerized cotton, and this is 821. It's rather like the Silco cornflower blue colour that I used for the applique, and so it'll sew in correctly on the trim. And my trim, I've made and ironed a crease down the length of it. To help with the thickness of the wadding and the quilting, I've changed my stitch length to a 3 before I add the trim. And I'm going to start by adding the trim down part way down one side, about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. I'm going to sew with a 1/4 inch. When I fold this over, this will give me a nice trim on both sides. I've spotted a problem. Do you remember I said that the width of my backing fabric only just came to the edge? Well, I've realised when I'm come to sew my trim on that I'm short on one side. So there's 2 ways to get round this, and that is to put a wider trim on all the way round, but I haven't got enough of that fabric to do that, or to trim it down again, and I'll need to take 1 inch off all the way around this outer border in order to do that, and that's what I've chosen to do. So I'm going to end up with a narrower border than I'd intended, but it can't be helped. So let me trim that down. I'll trim it down to 3.5 inches wide. Actually, I got away with just trimming off 1/2 inch, so I've now trimmed it down to a 4-inch border, and that will allow room for my trim. That worked. Use the weight of your extension table as something to take the weight of the quilt to stop it pulling from you, and I find it helpful to pin. Now, as you look here, you can see I'm using a guide here on my walking foot. I'm using this outside edge. I'm sewing on the trim so that the edge of the quilt lines up with the edge of the walking foot here. That way I'll get an equidistant line, stitch line, all the way around. To miter the corners, I sew up to 1/4 inch away from the edge. You can see that I've turned the corner without my fabric underneath the needle. I don't pivot on the needle. What I do is I allow about 1/2 inch over a fabric, and then I make sure that this folded line lines up so that it would give me a 90-degree angle. And then when I put the needle back in again, I'm going to put it in here. I found that if I don't leave enough fabric here, I end up with rounded corners. So this gives me a little bit extra to play with. People do it in different ways. This way works for me. Then when my needle go down again, it's not going to catch on this piece of fabric. I can feel it beneath my fingers. It's going to just begin on this piece of fabric. So there's now no raw edges showing. When I bring this fabric over it, I'm going to do the same with this. So I'm going to turn this fabric that way. Let me pin that as well. As you can see, there are no raw edges showing on this side. And I'm going to sew right the way across that to seal that in. And then all the raw edges are going to be on the inside. I'll cut this flush. I'll cut this edge flush with the quilt edge. I'm going to sew right the way down there now. So it now looks like this. When I flip it over, you can see I've got a double layer of thickness of fabric. And when I stitch, I will put a hand stitch in this bit and sew it to the other side. Right, that's the last bit of machine sewing. The rest of it is sewn in now by hand. And I'm going to sit in my comfy chair and watch some television, have a nice cup of coffee while I do that. I use a combination of pins and clips just to hold that trim in place. And I take the fabric over till it meets that inside seam line. My hand stitching, I want to just cover that seam line, and all those edges will just be neatened up. This is why I like to hand finish. I can check it all while I'm working. First, I've got to neaten that edge that I turned over. I'm using 2 strands of thread, and I'm starting on the front side of the quilt, just taking a stitch through just to neaten that edge. It's just an overstitch, and I'll take it through to the back. And then I sew it all the way around with a slip stitch. So this is what that turned over edge looks like. Let's get it in focus. It's neat. The folded under overlap is turned in neatly underneath. And as I'm going round, I'm making sure that this line of stitches isn't going to show. My sewing here isn't going to show on the front either. I'll show you what it looks like when I've finished it. I'm going to make a note of how long it takes to do this. Don't underestimate how long it takes to do this. It's a long way around this quilt to hand sew it. So this is the final quilt. Now, it was made from 25 jelly roll strips to begin with, and then I've added additional fabric and trim. And it's made for my friend Sandra's birthday, and it was inspired by a trip to Southport with loving memories built in. Now, Sandra is the person that crocheted the cushion that we're looking at here. So I think when we look at this quilt, she'll appreciate the trimmings on this. I've quilted it 2 inches apart, and I've appliqued hearts at the top as the quilting on the back. The trim added with mitered corners, and then at the bottom we have the crocheted lace and the wooden buttons. It's obviously, because of the backing fabric, it's obviously 1 inch shorter all the way around than I had intended, but actually I'm delighted with the outcome there. I'm going to get it in the post tomorrow, and for Sandra, my dear friend, I wish you a very happy birthday. This is Maggie, the Cheshire Crafter. Come back and see me again soon, won't you? Bye.